Dear brothers and sisters, as we are gathered, obviously, subhanAllah, I think that the response in the masjid here shows what's been on our hearts and our minds, our brothers and sisters in Palestine, our brothers and sisters in Gaza. The fact that this masjid looks like Ramadan, I think is a sign of how much this has occupied the hearts and minds. And I actually want to start off with saying that that is in and of itself a sign of Iman, a sign of faith. A sign of faith is that you love for your brother what you love for yourself. When you see your brothers and sisters in Palestine that are suffering in the way that they are suffering, then it is a sign of Iman that you care enough to exert yourself in dua, that you follow, that you ask yourself 1,000,000 times a day, what can we do for our brothers and sisters in Palestine? And this has not been an ordinary time. I think all of us can recognize that this time feels very different, that it feels, subhanAllah, like there's something that is happening that we're not accustomed to. It's not the usual. Unfortunately, we've become used to the usual, and the usual has been a few hundred people killed, and then the world moves on until the next time that Israel decides to pound Gaza once again, to agitate in Al-Aqsa once again, and then the world moves on. But I wanted to frame this from a spiritual perspective, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, before we make dua, before we talk specifically about Palestine. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives very specific instructions to how we should behave in victory and how we should behave in quote-unquote defeat. Understanding that there is no such thing as true defeat when we are connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there is no such thing as victory if that victory comes at the expense of your obligations to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But there are behaviors, there are attitudes, there are things that are attached to each of those circumstances. And basically what it boils down to is that you are to be humble in victory, you are to be hopeful in defeat. Humble in victory, hopeful in defeat, and connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala throughout all of that time. So I was thinking about, subhanAllah, what is being said to the believer as they pass away. We've had a lot of people pass away. At this very moment right now, people are dying. People are dying, and we can assume that the angels are saying to them what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said is said to them at the time of their death. إِنَّ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا رَبُّنَا اللَّهُ ثُمَّ اسْتَقَامُوا تَتَنَزَّلُ عَلَيْهِمُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ أَلَّا تَخَافُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا وَأَبْشِرُوا بِالْجَنَّةِ الَّتِي كُنْتُمْ تُوعَدُونَ. That verily those who say we believe and then they were firm, تَتَنَزَّلُ عَلَيْهِمُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ. The angels descend upon them at the time of their departure and say, do not be afraid, أَلَّا تَخَافُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا. Do not be afraid and do not grieve. وَأَبْشِرُوا بِالْجَنَّةِ الَّتِي كُنْتُمْ تُوعَدُونَ. And glad tidings for the paradise that awaits you. SubhanAllah, what we find from that ayah that is spoken to the righteous person as they are passing away, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow all of our martyred ones, all of our dying ones to be received with this, and may Allah Azza wa Jal allow us to be received with this. أَلَّا تَخَافُوا. Don't worry about that which comes after death. Don't be afraid. لَا تَخَافُ. What comes next is not going to be what you are accustomed to. All the horror, all the trauma, all of the hardship of this world is now gone. You are now returning to your Lord subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you're returning to His promise, you're returning to His comfort. أَلَّا تَخَافُوا. Don't be afraid. وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا. And don't grieve over the past. وَأَبْشِرُوا بِالْجَنَّةِ الَّتِي كُنْتُمْ تُوعَدُونَ. Here is the paradise you've been promised. As we watch our brothers and sisters pull their children out of the rubble, pull their loved ones out of the rubble, I want you to remember for a moment that what is said to them bi'idhnillahi ta'ala as they left this world is just that. Don't be afraid. You went to sleep last night without electricity. You went to sleep last night worrying about water. You went to sleep last night worrying about fuel. Don't be afraid. لا تخافوا. What comes next is no longer Gaza. What comes next is no longer occupation. You don't need to be afraid anymore. You're returning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to a garden that is only occupied by the righteous. لا تخافوا ولا تحزنوا. And don't grieve anymore over that which you've left behind.